Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this side event on accountability for human rights violations committed in the name of the war on drugs. My name is Niccolò Figattalamanca. I'm the Secretary General of No Peace Without Justice, and I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to moderate a panel discussion with experts both from the Philippines and from the United States to discuss how the global push to combat narcotics has become an occasion and a pretext for systematic human rights violations and state violence, including extrajudicial executions, torture, arbitrary detention, and crimes against humanity. In this side event, we link the ongoing ICC investigation and prosecution of former President of the Philippines, President Rodrigo Duterte, with the recent US military strikes on ostensibly civilian vessels in the Caribbean, exploring how international law can and does protect direct victims of those crimes. And also, we will look at the political dynamics that lead to state violence, including extrajudicial executions, but not only. I think the case of the Philippines provides a useful cautionary tale on how political wind can change and what can appear as something which is politically useful and interesting from the point of view of gaining popular support can and does sometimes result in possible accountability. But I don't want to preempt what the speakers will say. I'll briefly introduce them. Here to my left, Mr. Andres Ribeiro-Andres is the lawyer for the victims of Duterte's war on drugs, and he's the executive director of the Center for International Law in the Philippines. He's also listed as a counsel and a prospective counsel for victims at the ICC. Online, we also have Annie Shields, who's the advocacy director of the Center for Civilians in Conflict. Annie, I presume you can hear us. I can see you, and you can. I'm not sure whether when we turn on her microphone, but we'll take it when the time comes. And as well as David Bowden, who's the executive director of the DRC Net Foundation. And finally, on my right, I have Reverend Father Albert Alejo, who is a board member of No Peace Without Justice, but he's also a professor of social ethics at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. So I will, the format of this side event will be one of hopefully an active discussion. So I will ask the panelists to take and answer questions from both the online participants and the participants in the room. And but I will first try to ask them questions myself. And to that end, I will start the first round of questions. And in particular, I will ask here my dear colleague and friend, Gilbert Andreas, who's the lawyer for the victims. What is the impact of the war on drugs on the victim? What has been the impact in the Philippines? Is it over in any way? and what was the scale of the problem in the Philippines, so that we frame the issue also in terms of the level of intensity on the civilian population of the Philippines. Gilbert, you have.
Thank you, Nicolo, and also good afternoon to our colleagues. It's called the War on Drugs by the Duterte administration from 2016 to 2022, but it's actually the war on the poor. Why? It's really the low-income, high-density communities that were targeted. In fact, this can be confirmed if you look at the numerous reports that have been published by CSOs. Who are these low-income communities? Just to give you an idea, this table over here, this is already the size, the area of their homes, of their houses. One block composed of 10,000 people. So that's how high-density, low-income communities were targeted by the Duterte war on drugs. And just to humanize it, one of our clients, his son was just murdered by a police operation, and the mother herself was detained based on false drug charges, and the partner, who's actually pregnant, was detained together with the mother of the murdered son. This was also the modus operandi so that the family members will not file criminal complaints. In fact, when we visited the mother, he was literally just shaking out of the very fresh trauma he experienced and is still experiencing. In fact, he was released after months, and I think it took a year or 2 years before she was released on trump-up charges. So these are actually the communities that were affected. In fact, in one of the client communities that we have helped, there was a point that in 2016, I think from November to December of 2016, they just left their homes. Why? And they just went to the market, the public market, just to live there, so that if they will be murdered, it will be public, because they really felt the Oplan Tokhang operations against them. So CSO estimates have been 15,000 to 30,000. In fact, this has been cited in the Office of the Prosecutor request for investigation filed last May 2021. And the police, the Philippine National Police itself admitted that at least 6,000 people were killed during official police drug operations. So what were the other effects? So there were the murdered family members. There were also the secondary effects, such as arbitrary detentions of family members, just to unduly influence them not to file criminal complaints. And this was in the hundreds of thousands. In fact, there are estimates that at least 300,000 were victims of illegal, arbitrary detentions. Third, there were also stigmatization in their local communities, in their barangays, to the point some of them just left their barangays because the stigma of being a family member of a war on drug victims stayed with them in their barangay. Fourth, there was also economic, psychosocial dislocation because the target of the war on drugs were men of breadwinning capacities, and they were murdered, and there was really dislocation economically because the children still have to have food on the table as well as education, and yet because of the war on drugs, they just left their barangays. So this is essentially a war on the poor, and it's unfortunate that this happened in the Philippines, and the victims say this should not happen again in any region of the world. That's it for now.
Thank you. I'll get back to you on your work at the ICC and on the ongoing situation, but let me delve a little deeper on this, just to understand how this played out in the Philippines, and in particular, can you give us a sense of why? I mean, why target drug addicts? Why target particularly the drug addicts in the most vulnerable communities? I mean, what was the logic? Was it in terms of, was it the logic of law enforcement? Was it the logic of and how did the populations? I mean, obviously you've spoken about the impact on the families, which is devastating. But was it something that was appreciated by the population? Is it something that brought? Was there a political cost, or was it part of a political seeking consensus? I mean, what are the political dynamics, and what is the impact on the country as a whole? And then we'll move on to other speakers.
Well, the short answer is the war on drugs has been the campaign. It's really the focal point of the campaign of the Duterte presidency, because he has been the mayor of Davao City, which was once the largest city in the world by land area. And he has been actually implementing the war on drugs, meaning to say extrajudicial killings, as a means of attaining peace and order, so that it will also help the business climate. And he actually campaigned that he will do it on a national scale when he was campaigning during the 2016 May elections of the Philippines. And well, unfortunately, he won based on that campaign promise, and he implemented really that campaign promise all across the Philippines. So he brought with him the so-called Davao Death Squad and the Davao Boys, and really pointed them all across the Philippines so that they will be the focal point of extrajudicial killings. And unfortunately, that is still a Duterte formula, even until now. And they still hinge on that. And unfortunately, Mr. Duterte, especially with his arrest and surrender last March 12, is frankly popular with the Filipino diaspora, because allegedly he placed the Philippines on a peace and order path, but at the cost of extrajudicial killings, gross human rights violations, and international crimes such as crimes against humanity for murder.
So basically, the idea is the extrajudicial killings were implemented for the purposes of becoming popular with the
Popular because of peace and order.
And you didn't mention the scale. I mean, are we talking about 50 people killed, 500 people killed, 5,000 people killed? I mean, scale is important when we're talking about crimes of this nature.
Yes, I'll just talk of the temporal period of the ICC investigation. It's from November 1, 2011 until March 16, 2019, because the Philippines under Duterte actually withdrew from the ICC Rome Statute. And in that short period of time during the Duterte presidency, at least 6,000 were murdered under police operations. This is actually a public record recognized by the Philippine National Police, and estimates by CSOs 15,000 up to 30,000 murdered under the Duterte war on drugs, just for that 2011 until 2016, 2019 period.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I'll now turn to David. David Bowden, I mentioned, is the executive director of an organization focusing historically on the war on drugs, the DRC Net Foundation. David, you've been following, obviously, the Philippines case and the war on drugs since 2017. Particularly, you've been working also side by side at the United Nations Commission on Narcotic Drugs and other international meetings. Now, other than the Philippines, is the Philippines an isolated case where extrajudicial killings and other violations are committed deliberately and expressly for political gain under the banner of the war on drugs? I think.
Well, the Philippines is the largest and most well-known example. Unfortunately, it's not an isolated example. It was preceded in maybe 2006 by 3,000 killings in the drug war in Thailand called for by the former prime minister who just returned from exile, Shinawatra Thaksin. It was followed in close succession by killings numbering in the hundreds in both Indonesia and Bangladesh as well. And it can be argued that this happened in Brazil, although not distinctly from other types of police killings and not identified or called for as such, other than one campaign comment I recall from Bolsonaro.
Thank you, David. I mean, hopefully that won't happen in Indonesia again, but we've heard the current president floating perhaps a trial balloon to see whether what they call a tough approach on crime, which is actually a tough approach on the victims of the trade of narcotics, floating the idea that the war on drugs could turn again into a killing field. You mentioned those countries in Asia, but you're in the United States. Also, the White House reported the support by President Trump in his first administration for the policies of Duterte and praise of the Duterte anti-drug program. Is that something that should be of concern? And is that something that you think could potentially encourage others, including Widodo, in that direction?
I am worried about this, and we've warned on our email list to our membership, at least since February, that we should be concerned about the possibility that Trump could attempt Duterte-style drug war killings here in the U.S. Now, saying that's a possibility is not the same as saying it's likely. It's not something he campaigned on. It's not something I see a lot of people calling for here. But with what's happened in the Caribbean, and particularly how the president and his officials who were involved in the boat strikes have found support from some quarters for this, elements of the right that I wish I could say were fringe, but have mainstream platforms on outlets like CNN. I don't think we can rule it out. It seems more likely now than it did 2 weeks ago. And we have some real risk factors. We've seen increased aggressiveness and abusiveness by police in the US in the context of ramped up immigration enforcement, Trump's attempt to do mass deportations. The number of immigration and customs enforcement, ICE agents, is I think maybe set to double underfunding that Trump obtained from the Republican majority in its budget. That kind of expansion that quickly would be fraught with peril at the best of times. We're not in the best of times. The normalization of violence on the right, and let me say for U.S. audiences, violence is not exclusive to one political side, as we've seen. There is a particular systemic problem on the right in recent times. We've seen disturbing trends. There was a young man named Kyle Rittenhouse. This was during the height of the pandemic when there were large-scale Black Lives Matter protests in the cities. He traveled from out of state with his weapons, picked a fight with two protesters, then shot and killed them. Was acquitted of the murders and was lionized on the political right. Another warning sign is Trump's own popularity. Disapproval has been mounting, even among some of his supporters of extreme policies. And if come fall of next year or fall of 2028, he's feeling like he might lose the election. We don't know what he's capable of, what he might try. The trial balloon floated by the current Indonesian president in the height of protests against him. Maybe Trump will attempt a trial balloon, see if the drug war can resonate for him here in a different way. And we know what he's said about extrajudicial drug war killings. We know what he's done now. And things are, lots of things are happening here that are changing things. So we should be concerned and we should prepare in whatever ways we can to push back.
Thank you, David. You mentioned the Caribbean strikes. What has happened for background is that the United States has targeted allegedly drug-carrying civilian vessels in international waters in at least 4 different instances, sinking those ships in the high seas. On that, I would like to turn to Annie Shield, who's I mentioned she's the U.S. Director for the Center for Civilians in Conflict or CIVIC, and ask her maybe the most basic of questions: is that allowed? Is that legal? Can the U.S. Armed Forces sink civilian vessels at sea if those are suspected of carrying drugs? How does it work?
Thank you so much, and thank you all for having me. The short answer to your question is no. Legal. It is not legal under international law or under U.S. domestic law, and I can cover both briefly. Maybe starting with the fact that despite the fact that my organization focuses on the protection of civilians in conflict, it's important to start with the fact that when we talk about recent U.S. strikes in the Caribbean, there is no armed conflict here. Right? The U.S. is not at war against drug trafficking organizations, and alleged drug traffickers are not lawful military objectives. And so that means that whatever their identities may be, the people in the vessels that the U.S. struck were civilians, and the strikes therefore amounted to extrajudicial executions or murder. This is true under international law. As we all know, all people, no matter where they live, no matter what crime they have been accused of, have fundamental human rights, including the rights to life and to due process. That means that when someone is accused of a crime, they get a trial, not a summary execution. In this case, instead of interdicting the vessels, including some vessels that reports say were turning around at the time of the strikes, President Trump chose to simply kill the accused. No arrest, no evidence, no trial, just a summary execution. And indeed, many human rights organizations and UN Special Rapporteurs have condemned these strikes as extrajudicial killings in violation of international law. So that's the international law side of things. And then it's important to note that these strikes are also illegal under US domestic law. So under US law, it's the US Congress, not the US president, who has the constitutional role and responsibility to decide when, where, and against whom the United States uses force. Congress has not authorized the use of military force against criminal groups. And it's also important to note, because I know that people hear a lot about this, that the designation of a criminal group as a foreign terrorist organization, which is a term used in the United States, also does not have anything to do with wartime authorities. It does not unlock any exceptional war authorities. So where that leaves us is with a situation where, yes, these strikes are illegal under international and domestic law. And importantly, that also leaves us with the very dangerous precedent that the US president can execute people who have allegedly committed crimes without any due process. And I think it's worth noting that in addition to the precedents of the very harmful, quote, war on drugs that the United States has, and that David alluded to as well, you also have, these strikes also expand on decades of power abuses from the so-called war on terror in the United States, in which the US for many decades now has conducted lethal strikes to kill terror suspects outside of conflicts to which the US is a party, and in gross abuse of congressional authorizations. But I think they also, for some of the reasons I mentioned, break dangerous new ground as well. And I would actually agree with the assessment that David raised that, under the administration's apparent reasoning for these strikes, there seems to be very little preventing murders of alleged criminals inside the United States. It also sets us up for very concerning risks of further escalation, including possible US strikes within territory of other countries in the region. So the stakes here, both legal and moral, are very, very high.
Thank you. Follow up. You mentioned that Congress has the right and the responsibility to declare armed conflict within the United States. Can you comment on the proposed authorization bill, authorization for the use of military force aimed specifically at narco-terrorism that has been circulating in Congress, and what would the impact of that be in terms of the ability of the United States to be legal, let's say, under domestic law, if not under it, in its what is currently a policy of extrajudicial killings?
Yes, thank you. So yes, there have been reports, as you mentioned, of a draft authorization for the use of military force, an AUMF, circulating within the US Congress around that would authorize the kind of use of force that we're seeing. It's very, very important that that not pass. That opens very, very concerning doors for the use of force. And as we've seen, the way that US authorizations to use military force have been drafted in the past open them up to gross abuse, which we have seen with past authorizations as well in, as I mentioned, the so-called war on terror. I do think it's really important to mention, though, that as you, I think, kind of mentioned in the question, regardless of whether an authorization to use military force were to be passed, which would be very, very concerning if it were, that has no bearing on the legality of these strikes under international law. These strikes would continue to be illegal under international law because there is no armed conflict. And as a result, of course, they would be extrajudicial executions. I also think it's worth mentioning that, that's one piece of the congressional conversation. Congress also has another tool at its disposal that is important to use right now, and that's a war powers resolution. So because of congressional power on war authorities in the US, Congress also has the ability to block the use of armed forces in hostilities through what's called the war powers resolution. Both chambers of the US Congress have introduced these resolutions now, and so it's also very important that Congress work to pass those to block further strikes.
Thank you. And let me follow up just quickly, similar to to my question on the political dynamics. I mean, obviously, sinking 3 or 4 boats is not going to have a big impact on the smuggling of drugs from the southern part of the American continent to the northern part of the Americas. We're talking about drops in an ocean, or in terms of overall flow, and yet those were highly publicized, and even with videos issued the Department of Defense, or Department of War, as is now calling itself, and by the White House. What is the real impact in terms of availability of drugs, use of drugs, and if it is negligible, as one can imagine, what is the real purpose of those strikes in reality?
Thank you for the question. Unfortunately, I think we're seeing an unfortunate bringing together of various kind of fields. And so I'll say that I have a lot to learn about drug policy myself. So the kind of impact on drug trade is not really something I can comment on as well. And so perhaps David wants to jump in on that one. But in terms of what the real, purpose and what people need to understand in the United States is that no matter what the identities of the people on the boats were, right, we don't know. But regardless, what we are talking about is the president trying to claim the authority that he can execute anyone he accuses of a crime. That is what the stakes are here, right? And so again, that people need to understand that is a significant concern globally, but it's also a concern that could come back within the United States. Yes, when we talk about a war on drugs, and also when we talk about any other kinds of, crimes that the president wants to accuse someone of, when you lose that due process, that's the fundamental right that you lose to defend yourself against any accusation. So those are really the stakes that we're talking about. And I think that's a message that's really important for people inside the United States to understand as well, when it comes to drug policy, and also when it comes to other spaces as well. And I will say we have seen that message come in different ways from both Democrats and Republicans, but it's one that needs to be much, much louder.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm going to move over to Father Albert soon. But let me go back. Let me go back on the question of the political dynamics and the why, and go back to the Philippines example. I mean, you mentioned that part of the objective was popular support, and showing that a strong president is on your side if you're part of a community which is devastated by drugs and willing to do what it takes. So there's a macho and the sense of the state being in the hands of somebody who's willing to bend or break the rules in order to defend you. But there's also a different impact, which is Senator De Lima was in prison for years, and the political opposition between the red tagging and the potential accusation of drug trafficking, including against people like Senator De Lima, was silenced, or attempts were made to silence and intimidate them. So there's a state violence and the release of violence as a form of intimidation in the Philippines historically under Duterte. How did that play out in practice? I mean, was this advantageous to his presidency? Is it continues to be advantageous to his daughter's candidacy? I mean, how does it play out?
Oh, it played out well for Mr. Duterte, because in fact, the current vice president is his daughter. Sara Duterte, and it's the first time that happened in Philippine politics that the president was able to carry over his popularity in the second highest position, which is vice president. And in fact, there are some estimates and some surveys that VP Sara Duterte is now the front runner in the 2028 elections. So there's really that Duterte clout and power and influence over the Philippine society because of that macho image, and which was actually carried over to his daughter, that they can allegedly really bring peace and prosperity using that Duterte formula of a strong man and now maybe a strong woman persona.
To what extent do you think the idea of the leader of the country being able to order a hit essentially on anybody is part of the political projection that leads to those decisions? I'll just very briefly, I mean, we know that the purpose is not stopping drugs. We understand that the purpose is showing a certain strength on an issue of national concern, which is the use of narcotics. Is there an intimidation objective also in the US? Is the purpose also to make people wonder, you know, if the president can do this, can they do whatever they want, including against me? And I'm not sure who to turn to, but I'll start with David. We cannot hear you, David. Can you start again? Check the mute button.
Yes, apologies. Could you quickly restate the question for me? I was looking at my notes. Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Can I circle to Annie on the question of whether there's a political intimidation objective as well, hidden somewhere there, or maybe not so hidden?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly can't. I'm not in the president's head. I cannot speak to his intent, but I would say certainly that this is. I mean, so I don't know about intimidation as a goal, but yes, this should be seen as a power grab, right? This is an attempt to claim authorities that the president does not have legally to go after people that he says have committed a crime. So I would kind of go back to that piece that yes, that is a significant concern, and I don't think it's far-fetched to say that that it is an extremely slippery slope to other similar concerning policies, both globally and domestically, because that is how the erosion of rule of law happens. So I think it's very concerning.
Thank you.
I'd add to that intimidation could take the form of making people who live in democratic stronghold areas a little afraid to leave their homes when it's time to go vote. I think a few shootings could accomplish that very effectively. That's one of the reasons I'm worried.
Thank you, David. Now, I've neglected Father Albert here to my right, but on the issue of state violence, I mean, this is what we're talking about, is not violence by a group or a person, but institutionalized violence, state violence. How does that? What are the dynamics that you can guide us through as to how that plays out? Whether the Philippines, whether Indonesia, whether in the United States, in the Caribbean, what would you what would you say that that the dynamics are in that sense?
You're fond of dynamics, political.
Yeah.
What exactly are you fishing?
Go for it.
No, one problem here is you have a problem. You want to run after the syndicates because they destroy the culture, they destroy the minds, and they make a lot of money out of that. At the same time, you don't want that the victims would be the ordinary people, the ordinary users. No, and so, and the people now are divided on that. If you are focusing on running after the syndicates, then you might say, okay, put the Laila de Lima to jail, etc., the rivals, but at the same time, you want to protect the ordinary people. And so maybe we can discuss that later. But what I'd like to introduce here is my shifting to another concern. For the past several years, since 2016, and through the help of No Peace Without Justice, we have been focusing on body count, how many are killed extrajudicially. But I'd like to call attention to those who are victimized by the war on drugs judicially. In other words, there is such a thing as extrajudicial killings, but I think there is also the thing of judicial violence. And what do I mean? I started thinking about this when last year, or maybe 1.5 years ago, I visited my nephew who was jailed in the National Penitentiary. He is less than 40 years old. I gave a talk to the staff of the National Penitentiary, and I said, may I visit my nephew? And they said, oh, fine. Where is he? He stays in the maximum security. How many people are in the maximum security? 14,000. I visited another friend who is in the minimum and minimum security. How many are in the minimum security? 1,000. What's happening here? What's happening here? Apparently, following the law, the judges would put even minor criminals on par with those who are committing heinous crimes. The maximum security section, I thought, would be for those masterminds of the shadow economy. And yet, my nephew was caught with a few portions of grams of shabu or methamphetamine, and yet he was sentenced life sentence. That means 20 to 30 years of imprisonment. Now, that called my attention that aside from the killings, there are other victims. So I call attention to the mass arrests. During the time of President Duterte, from 2016 to 2022, there was a surge of prisoners. So our prisons got bloated, and about 56% of that bloating, that the spike, was related to drugs cases. Now, it's not only the number of people being put to jail, it's also the excessive sentences. I'll tell you, and it's just following the law. That's why later on I'd like to propose a legislative reform. Possession of less than 1 gram of shabu, a synthetic drug, could lead you to 12 to 20 years of imprisonment. Possession of 5 grams, life imprisonment. And this is frequently given by the judges. Drug user voluntarily surrendering, compulsory rehab. Small-scale street peddler, life imprisonment. Possessing 5 grams, under 5 grams of marijuana, 12 years. Same as shabu in practice. And repeat offenders, life imprisonment, no proportionality applied. And so there's another point. For me, it is equivalent to torture. Yes, they were not killed. Probably, according to some, it's because of the compassion of the judges. I better put them in jail lest they get killed outside. Is that a good choice? Now that there is also what Nicolo mentioned. Okay, you put a number of people to jail, but some of these people are really unjustly jailed, like Laila de Lima. It turns out after serving almost 7 years in prison as a new senator, it turned out she was not guilty at all. Now, are we talking of death outside? No. There is also an increase of death inside the jail. In 2016 to 2022, there was a surge of death inside the jail, and many of these are related to the drugs prisoners. Now, some of them, if you are not killed, you are not jailed, you are sent into forced rehabilitation and all kinds of things. Now, we have another research on this, but it doesn't mean that if we change the paradigm from punitive, meaning putting people to jail or killing them, you are serving human rights by putting them in a forced rehabilitation, because there is also a lot of inhumane treatment within the forced rehabilitation centers. Now, there is also this practice of drug dependency evaluation, compulsory drug dependency evaluation, and you have to pay. So in general, we need to expand our category of victims when we are talking about the war on drugs. And that is partly my call. And I think this is not just a matter of leniency in interpreting the law. I think there is really a call for changing Republic Act 9165. And I would imagine it would be nice to have more humane punishment and let this reform be retroactive. Maybe we can learn from Malaysia, who has removed the mandatory death penalty when it comes to drug cases. Now, I'd like to add one more thing. I think we need to include the issue of corruption. Who is benefiting from all this war on drugs? And who is financing the war on drugs? You can have volunteer blood donors. You can have volunteers in climate change rescue operation, but you don't have volunteer killers. There is corruption here. Now, not just in the killing, but also in incarceration. Who is benefiting if you have plenty of people incarcerated? According to some researchers, there has been an increase in the so-called budget per capita of the prisoners. Before 2016, the budget per capita per year was 38,000 pesos. During the time of Duterte, it doubled up to 72,500 per year. Recently, from 2023 to 2024, now the per capita budget is 126. Maybe it's more humane, but I think some people are benefiting from the overstaying of many prisoners. There are laws in computing to the years of service to shorten their incarceration, but they're not doing that. Somebody has developed an app to accurately compute the number of years that should be served, but they're not applying that. So aside from legislative reform, there is a call here for investigation. How is the war on drugs financed? Is how much comes from the national government, treasury, the local government, and how much of the war on drugs was financed by foreign development aid? I think that is sensitive. And finally, who is benefiting from putting more people in jail? I suspect, some of us suspect, that some people are consider this as a source of corruption. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Albert, for that, for those thoughts. We have 2 minutes left, so I would ask our panelists if we can go around with one sentence. Annie, I was going to ask you about legal accountability. We know how it went for Duterte. He's now in a prison cell in The Hague, awaiting trial. And there's lots of challenges there. But very briefly, do you see anything like that in 15 seconds or 30 seconds, if you like, happening in the US?
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. I mean, obviously, accountability is really critical. And as I think many of us know, historically very, very challenging in the US context, both due to challenges with the domestic prosecution of government officials when it comes to national security matters and immunity, and also due to US rejection of ICC jurisdiction. So I don't have answers there, but I do think these kinds of cross-context conversations are really, really important because there's a lot for us to learn in the U.S. context as well. But I also, we also think about accountability in very broad terms. And so in addition to the really important legal accountability mechanisms, I also return to, the importance of global condemnation of these strikes and also domestic condemnation by the U.S. Congress. And, there are other tools Congress can use as well, like refusing to fund these kinds of strikes and demanding investigations as well. And then, of course, the importance of victim-centered accountability as well, which has its own challenges with, being able to safely access the families of those killed in these strikes. So I think worth a lot more discussion, but I think I'm past my 30 seconds. So
thank you very much. David, you mentioned the political challenges, people being afraid to turn, to walk down to the polling booths on election day. It's almost a cataclysmic, but everything we thought was impossible then became possible in the last few months. In 15 seconds, what can we do?
We need to insist that leaders who claim the mantle of democracy hold the line, as Maria Ressa says, about what's right and what's wrong, even when the issue is immigration, even when the issue is drugs. Because if they won't, the opposition will be divided, and this is one of the ways in which authoritarianism progresses.
Thank you, David. So murder is murder, whoever is the victim. Now, you have the privilege, Gabriel, of the last word. Very, very quickly, we have somebody who's waiting at the door to start the next session.
Yes, on behalf of the victims of the Philippine war on drugs, we have 3 calls. Number 1, please stop all disinformation with respect to the ICC proceedings, because this information re-traumatizes the victims. Secondly, the victims call on all Philippine sectors of society and all concerned to respect the victims' right to justice and right to the truth. And third, the victims actually call for respect for the ICC proceedings because this is also a victim-centered proceedings. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And we'll keep on fighting. We'll hold the line. Thank you for being with us, both in person and online.